Hey guys, welcome back to the Tower Show. In this video, this might be considered a little bit of a hot take, but we're talking about a term that gets thrown a lot in the horror community today. We're talking about elevated horror. If I were to rattle off a list of movies to you, like Us, Get Out, Midsommar, The Babadook, The Witch, Substance, anybody who's in the horror circle, even a normie, might say, that's elevated horror. But what is elevated horror, and what work is that term or subgenre really doing? Like, what heavy lifting is it doing? Like, why do we need it? Is it necessary? So let's unpack that together and see, like, what really is elevated horror? What makes a movie elevated horror? Is it the slow pacing? Is it the fact that it's a period piece and it takes place in the past? Is it the fact that it was produced by A24? Is it the fact that it deals with family trauma and or general trauma? Is it the fact that it deals with feelings? Is it the fact that it has a 15-minute dinner scene smack in the movie? Is that what makes it elevated horror? Because before we can delve into it, we really got to nail it down. Like, what makes this elevated? But honestly, we got to be honest with ourselves, right? Horror has always been the cousin that gets relegated to the corner. It's the one that film critics ignore when it comes to award seasons, because horror is a low-budget vehicle and it's an entryway for a lot of actors and directors and people to get into the business. So horror has never been the favorite child when it comes to genre. Like comedy, drama, action has always been like the cousins that get all the attention. Horror is always back there in the corner. So it's kind of odd that when a movie starts getting its flowers in the mainstream, it doesn't get called horror. It gets called elevated horror. And I feel like this is a way to distinguish from all the gory stuff or the slasher stuff that they might not think is actually mainstream or they want to bring home to the family. Elevated horror is something safe for you to share with your coworkers and bring to the family retreat or the company retreat, right? It's elevated horror. It's elevated, right? Everything else, you don't want to discuss that. So I feel like that's some of the lifting that it's doing. It's like creating a class that's acceptable to discuss. You know, like that kid who wears the Friday the 13th t-shirt in the summer and knows every kill in Friday 13th Part 5, right? You're not that person. You're elevated. But honestly, even if you're not elevated, what it is doing, it's opening up the circus tent, right, to other people to come into the genre and to feel safe. Because honestly, I feel like a lot of it has to do with the fact that the horror genre or brand keeps people out. So I feel like it makes it safe. I'm not gatekeeping. Like this video is not about. I'm not into gatekeeping. I'm not gatekeeping horror. If elevated horror allows more people to stomach it and come into the genre, then awesome. Like all those films that I mentioned, I enjoy all those films. Well, not all of them, but I enjoy a lot of those films. So I'm not gatekeeping. If it's something, if it's a way for other people to come into horror and say, hey, this is pretty awesome here. I kind of like it. But as long as you don't start moving the chairs around, right? Put them back where you left them. If it does that, then great. But let's not lie to ourselves and say that elevated horror is somehow different than horror itself. Horror is basically the same horror that's been here. It's just whenever it goes mainstream, for some reason, it's palpable to call it elevated. But we also got to admit, when something goes mainstream and it's not elevated the way that they like it, it doesn't hit the same and it doesn't get the elevated horror title. Like there's a lot of all these indie movies that I mentioned before, which are like indie hits, right? But what about Terrifier 2, a movie that cannot be denied its flowers? Like Damien Leone's Terrifier 2 brought the heat. It brought the monetary heat to it in relation to his budget, but it doesn't get the elevated horror title, right? But it did do its thing, and I feel like it brought a lot of people into the horror umbrella, but it doesn't get its flowers the same way, and we're not going to see it at the Oscars. So let's not make believe like that everything is treated the same when it comes to horror. Some films, for some reason, are elevated and some are not. And even when the indie hits like Terrifier come along, like we did that horror community, we put our money where it mattered. We backed Terrifier 2, or with James Wan's Saw, which was revolutionary. And now we have Malignant and the whole Conjuring universe. These movies, even though they are financially successful to the point that we have a Conjuring universe, they don't get the elevated horror title. So let's not make believe like there isn't two different worlds when it comes to horror. Like certain films and certain production companies are treated very different than certain other films. Like Hostel, I thought was revolutionary in a way. But a lot of people weren't calling Hostel, oh my God, it's a masterpiece. But Hostel gets its flowers in the horror community, right? The Conjuring gets its flowers in the horror community. Terrifier 2 and Terrifier 3 definitely gets its flowers in the horror community. but they're not considered elevated. So that's also, I want to bring light to that all films are not treated the same, and a film being elevated horror gets some prestige, while movies that a lot of us enjoy, and we've been in the horror community holding it down since we were like, even when we were not supposed to watch those movies, but our films don't get the same praise. So there is two different subgenres here at play, or there's multiple subgenres, and they all don't get the same amount of prestige as elevated horror. The truth is that horror is horror. Sometimes it's classy, sometimes it's brutal, sometimes it's gory. It's all horror. And I understand the title is helping some people come into our tent, and I'm happy for that. But let's not make believe like horror's always been the stepchild that it is. Like, for example, look at my beef. A lot of these streaming services, they have their own separate tab for comedy and for drama. But when it comes to horror, we have to share it with sci-fi. And I love sci-fi, but still, all the horror films and the sci-fi films under one tab. How come action gets its own tab? Family movies gets its own tab. Romance gets its own tab. But when it comes to horror, here's one tab you share with sci-fi. Completely two different genres. Yes, there could be a horror sci-fi. Shout out to Alien Romulus. But that doesn't mean that we have to all be in the same category, right? Like Ex Machina, for example, even though I just made a video, check that out. I said it is a horror movie. But it's like when it comes to horror, we're always left at the back. It's like the stuff that we enjoy is not admissible to the general public in a way. And some films obviously are not. I'm not going to say it's not. But it's messed up that they have to have different titles and subgenres to actually propel it forward and to make it acceptable to be spoken about in certain spaces, honestly. And that's what elevated horror is doing. So to wrap this up, if you enjoy Get Out, that's awesome. If you like Midsommar, awesome. The Witch, awesome. If you enjoy Terrifier, awesome. If you enjoy Saw, awesome. If you enjoy Hostel, awesome. These are all great films, and they're not going to be for everyone. Just like every other genre is not going to be for everyone. But let's not kid ourselves that elevated horror is just horror, honestly, and it's just allowing other people to enjoy horror who usually wouldn't. But if it's welcoming more people into the tent, then I'm all for it. Like I said, I'm not here to gatekeep anything. I just think it's a conversation I think we should have. I think it's kind of odd and funny how this subgenre has basically overtaken horror as far as like prestige, or just like when people are talking about horror, like they don't talk about, Hellraiser. Well, they do talk about Hellraiser if you're in the horror community, but in certain circles, that's not the horror that gets the praise. So anyway, guys, what do you guys think? Do you think we need a subtitle of elevated horror? Do you think elevated horror is doing what I just said, is doing a lot of lifting for people who are normies to actually feel confident and comfortable coming into this space? If so, that's awesome. Put it in the comments. Let me know what you think. As always, guys, this is a conversation. This is the Tone Show. Hit the like button, subscribe for more Tone Show. Tone Show.